Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, Episode 20. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Zenel Garcia. Zenel is an associate professor of security studies at the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. His research focuses on the intersection of international relations theory, security, and geopolitics, specifically how interpretations of security and the geopolitical environment shape the policy preferences of states in the Indo-Pacific and Eurasia. He's the author of China's Western Frontier and Eurasia, The Politics of State and Region Building, and China's Military Modernization, Japan's Normalization, and the South China Sea Territorial Disputes. He also has published several peer-reviewed articles focused on the impacts of Chinese foreign policy. Zenel, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. As I mentioned in the pre-show, we like to try to give our audience a sense of how you came to be talking about things like Chinese foreign policy and regionalism. The joke every time is you probably didn't grow up thinking this is what you were going to do, and somewhere along the way, there were experiences that led you in this direction. So if you wouldn't mind, indulge us and share a little bit of the arc of your career development that brought you to show up at a place like the Army War College talking about these cool things.
Thank you for the invitation, Steve. It's a wonderful opportunity. And you're right. I did not start thinking about China early on. In fact, I was an engineer major as an undergrad at Florida International University. One of the odd things in life is that, I took a course on contemporary international problems about my second year in 2006. And surely enough, I found that class to be incredibly fascinating. The professor was super engaging. I was having a blast going to the class, despite of the fact that the amount of reading was absolutely insane. It was not my wheelhouse. I found myself following this professor after class every single day just to ask them more questions. And at some point, it just clicked for me that year. I don't want to do engineering. I want to do what you do. So how do I get there? And his response was, well, to do what I do, you need a PhD. To get a PhD, you should probably start thinking about specializing into something, right? And so what I decided to then think through is, okay, what will I specialize on? And surely enough, I really wanted to do something related to regions, just a matter of which one. Having come from Cuba originally, Latin America would have made perfect sense. But as inaccurate as the statement will sound, it felt familiar, so I didn't think I needed to go there. Obviously, people that specialize in Latin America will tell me I'm way wrong, and they're right. But that wasn't it at the time, right? The European continent felt like the old country. That wasn't it either. The Middle East was super interesting to me at the time. We're in the middle of the global war on terror. It seemed to be in the news. I didn't feel like I could do field work there at the time. I landed on East Asia because, quite frankly, the last one left was the African continent, and I had no knowledge. Turns out part of my family is originally from China, railroad workers that went on to Cuba. And so I figure, you know what, why don't we go here? China's this big thing. Florida International has a pretty sizable Asian studies program. It's humanities heavy and Japan heavy, actually. But I love the professors there, so I figured let's just go do that. And that's kind of how I ended up studying China and international relations.
Well, that's a great story. I love the way it ties together where your pieces of your family had come from, and also sort of the wacky journey through the university experience. I myself may have been guilty of a little bit of that. I was originally a mathematics and computer science major, and this is the first time my grandfathers were concerned that I threw away my career by focusing on Chinese language and literature, and then later other kinds of subjects on top of that. We're glad you made the choice. So let's jump in a little bit. So you go through the university experience, you start specializing. How do you make the transition from studying these kinds of things to then making it to a place like a war college? A lot of people might wonder, what are war colleges? How many of these are there, and what do they do?
That's a great question, because quite frankly, they were not in my radar as I'm going through grad school. I don't think, outside of military historians and, people in uniform that go to school, they're not necessarily aware of PME more broadly. But my first conference I did, it was ISA Northeast. It was in Providence. And I had this paper on China's military modernization, which I thought was an okay class paper. I submitted it, I get accepted, I go, and I decide I'm going to Google my co-panelist. Turns out one of those co-panelists is somebody that I had cited, and I was absolutely terrified because that person is Dr. James R. Holmes, who is in the Naval War College. I figured, well, this could go pretty well if he likes the paper, or he can just tell me, you got me way wrong, right? But he was incredibly gracious. He liked the paper. We spoke after the conference, and he pretty much tuned me in throughout the year. So like, hey, you should consider thinking about working at a war college. And my response was, I don't know what these things are. I'm not even sure they would hire somebody like me, right? You have a military background, I don't. And he said, well, we hire civilians all the time. Just keep it in your radar. So when I graduated, my first offer was to go and be a visitor in St. Lawrence University in northern New York. It's about an hour north of Fort Drum. And I spent 3 years there. And I interviewed here at the Army War College in 2019. Did not get the job. Mm-hmm. But I think I left a good enough impression that they kept inviting me to reapply, and I did. So in 2021, I was made an offer I couldn't refuse. And this is the beginning of my third year, and I've had a great time here so far.
Well, that's excellent. I do think that it's a little bit of a topic out there where most people think that if you're at a war college, you must have been like a military officer. And I've actually had a number of friends that have come from the civilian side of life and made good careers there. And it is in many ways just like any other Institute of Strategic Studies that could be in lots of different places around the world. But congratulations on that. Now, let's shift gears a little bit into our subject matter. So we spent a lot of time, it is after all called the China Desk podcast, trying to talk about and better understand what's happening in China, why its leadership might think or act the way it does. And these days, as you no doubt see and maybe even participate in on any given day on TV, radio, or otherwise, someone's being asked to interpret what's happening in China, how likely is a war, why are they doing this or that. So let's do some of that. But first, let's start with the question about what do you think most people who work in U.S. policy fail to understand about China's motivations and the regional dynamics that are that it's influenced by. So we have tons of people out there that read the tea leaves. It's sort of based on Kremlinology of the old Cold War, looking at the Soviet Union. But really, there are elements of regional dynamics that influence what China is doing. But what do you think U.S. policy mostly fails to understand when trying to understand China's motivations?
Yeah, this is a question that really animated my second book that looks at China's Western frontier. I think if I have to distill it to one major thing that we miss, is that a key motivator, of course, for the CCP, most people will agree, of course, is stability, and that stability is coming from economic development. But when you begin to break down what economic development really means for the CCP, is that they are at a stage in which that development has been incredibly uneven, mostly concentrated on the coastline. And the problem that they've been unable to solve, despite of internally speaking about this for the last 30 plus years, is the development gap between the coast and the interior, right? And how do they generate an engine that can attract foreign direct investment to have a sustainable development in the interior of the country? So an argument that I think gets lost in the mix, for example, is that when we look at the Belt and Road, right, especially if we're sitting in the DC Beltway area, the automatic assumption is made that the Belt and Road is inherently a geopolitical construct, right? Xi Jinping thinks about it, starts in 2013, and you move on. Now, without a doubt, Xi Jinping announces the Belt and Road Initiative, although he doesn't really come up with the meat and bones of it, quite frankly. The Belt and Road, if you look at all the projects, if you look at the corridors that are announced in 2013 and the ones that continue to be highlighted, every single one of those corridors originates at a provincial level initiative that was promoted by provincial level officials in an effort to generate some sort of development in their frontier provinces, right? This is part, if you look at a place like Xinjiang, for example, they're inherently connected to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, to the China-Central Asia-West Asia Economic Corridor, to the New Eurasian Land Bridge. All three of those technically originate in Xinjiang internal politics, really, in the 90s and early 2000s, as they're thinking about how do we bring economic development here, because they have multiple incentives. One, at the provincial level, bringing economic development helps you move up the food chain, right? Promotion. But other, the CCP inherently believes that economic development brings social stability. Now, we could debate whether how accurate that is and where that development goes, right? But that is inherently what their internal discourse seems to be. So when we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, yes, there are geopolitical components to it, and those matter. But I argue fundamentally the Belt and Road Initiative is really to be able to generate new supply chains that link the interior of China to adjacent regions and beyond, because this seems to be, from their own writing, one of the most logical ways for them to bring economic development to an area that otherwise would not be receiving a lot of foreign direct investment, right? It's almost like if you build it, they will come, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really, really good insight because, and I do think that most people that are looking at this at top levels of U.S. policy and media analysis, don't get the domestic driver part of this that you described of the coastal versus interior. They also probably don't understand that historically these weren't parts of China. There aren't centuries of interaction that have worn well-beaten paths of people and resources, and even transportation from China's far west to its coast in some ways is more difficult than these land bridges and otherwise that connect the neighboring countries. And so I think that's an actually very important insight to really understand China and also why the Belt and Road would come to being, because you're exactly right. I mean, at first blush, it looks just like a countering or balancing America kind of play. And yet there's this other part. Now, I think both of us would agree, and we know that there is they don't mind it looking like it is competing with America. But as you've kind of framed it, that might be icing on the cake, not necessarily the prime mover in doing that. Have I got that about right?
Yeah, I think that nails it right on the head. I think what's really fascinating to me about studying the Belt and Road from this perspective is that the deeper you dig, the more fragmented it looks, right? So for people that study Chinese domestic politics, right, there's a framework that has existed, I guess, now for the better part of 20 years of fragmented authoritarianism, right? That China in practice is governed, right? The guy at the top makes a slogan, everybody else interprets it, and the policy that gets implemented can vary widely from place to place because different investments by stakeholders, factionalism, but also the fact that the CCP in general, even under Xi Jinping, allows for some level of experimentation by lower levels of government. So when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative from that perspective, right, you have your vision statements, right? You have the Belt and Road vision documents. There's been at least two of these. But they're pretty broad. They could be interpreted in a million ways. And you find that the provinces compete with each other for basically situating themselves as a gateway to another region so that they can then attract more investment from central authorities and bring in more investment from foreign investors, right? That can because they're making the case, hey, look, we're a hub. And we're the hub that connects you to Chinese internal markets, and we're also the hub that connects you to this region more broadly. There are geopolitical effects to this, right? And there's no doubt that, Xi and other officials, Minister of Foreign Affairs, et cetera, will go out and promote this as, China being a responsible stakeholder in the international system that's bringing development and capacity to developing countries. And to a degree, all of these things can tick off a box. But the implementation of projects is so fragmented, and there's so much local interplay there that it's not a single story.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it probably also gives it lower odds of having the strategic impact that a lot of global analysts would assume because of this fragmentation. And also maybe not 100% buy-in by the central government about each and every one of these moves, which I think is a not necessarily a non-mainstream assessment of the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's just a part that I think most people wouldn't think to add weight to as they assess it. Well, there's another big topic in the news that I think has external impact on China's foreign policy, but also has a major impact on how we in the United States and the world talk about what China's motives are. And so if you wouldn't mind, talk a little bit about the recent actions that make it appear like China is taking Russia's side in the Ukraine war over the past year. What kind of an insight does that give us for the potential future actions they could take in the Indo-Pacific or the wider global issues?
That's an interesting question. So last year, I co-authored a piece on this topic, Sino-Russian relations and the war in Ukraine. And we were tackling precisely this problem, right? This notion that from our perspective here in the United States and perhaps Eastern Europe more broadly, it certainly looks like China has taken Russia's side, and definitely rhetorically, we can make a really strong argument that China's talking points on this war are pretty much Moscow's talking points on the issue, right? The sense that the security of all parties needs to be respected, right? Which is pretty much kind of the, essentially Moscow's complaint about NATO's expansion, et cetera. And so one of the arguments that my colleague Kevin Modlin and I make in this paper and another op-ed that we made for The Diplomat was that the Sino-Russian relationship is probably best understood as a limited partnership. And there's a broad agreement at this, the systemic level about wanting to promote a multipolar order and accelerate the emergence of that order. And they see that as mutually beneficial because, of course, that would mean that limits the ability of the United States and our allies and partners to operate in the way that we have done so since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And China and Russia see each other as important poles in this multipolar order because, again, it helps maintain that check on what they perceive to be American hegemony. However, when you begin to unpack what that partnership actually looks like, right, we're talking about policy cooperation, perhaps, at that level. What they lack is coordination because they don't want to make serious commitments to each other. Right? China's effectively locked in an awkward position because what Russia is doing in Ukraine effectively undermines what China claims to champion internationally, which is, right, very strong interpretation of sovereignty and territorial integrity, right? That's 99% of their arguments about, our actions in the international system. So that's certainly uncomfortable. And added to this, it's probably not in their interest to see Russia fundamentally lose. Because if Russia loses, then its position as a great power, its position in that multipolar order is brought into question. And this is very problematic because historically, Russia and China obviously share a long border, and historically not a very stable one, right? And so the Chinese probably are not excited that Russia is doing this, but they are also not going to throw it under the bus because an even weaker Russia probably not going to be able to play the role that it wants to. But by the way, a weakened Russia can still make a lot of trouble in China's frontier regions, which is not in the interest of the CCP. Added to that, we make an argument that at the end of the day, China has figured out in the last 2 years how to reap benefits from what Russia has done. Sometimes, quite frankly, at the expense of Russia. And this is not new because China has been able to capitalize on Russia shooting itself in the foot, quite literally, since the Soviet collapse. So if you track Chinese Central Asian relations, a lot of the foundations for that bilateral relation occurs because of Russia's and Federation's efforts, right, to maintain that kind of monopoly of influence in the region. And so by overplaying that hand, they've effectively made a case for Central Asian leaders to try to diversify. So if you start studying, what used to be called the multi-vector foreign policies out of, Kazakhstan and other Central Asian republics, a lot of the motivation for this is basically to wean themselves a bit off Russian influence by bringing another player into the table. And they'll bring the EU and they bring the United States into the table as well by basically trying to get everybody to invest, have a stake in the stability of those countries so that the other side doesn't get to make a significant claim. So in a nutshell, the way that I see the Sino-Russian relationship is that there's agreement that they want to accelerate a multipolar order, and there's mutual interest in ensuring that that happens. But in actually making commitments to help each other out, or in this case, China helping Russia out militarily or significant material support to Russia, there's less of an incentive mechanism there because the costs are higher than the benefits to be received. And the third part of that is that China has learned how to navigate the headache that Russia has given it by extracting concessions out of Russia on energy prices, on projects, on regional influence, quite frankly. And at the same time, able to use the effects of the Ukraine war as a rhetorical point in the global South for why the United States is also to blame for this.
Yeah, that does seem to be a direct linkage between Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the imposition of NATO and Western sanctions, the adjustments that were made by Russia and China through that cycle, and then somewhat acceleration into the BRICS. It's something that is in the news and conversation much more now, having recently had a summit where there's a talk of expanding membership, whether that is going to make a strategic difference or not. It does seem to have accelerated out of the perceptions of what's happening among the key actors with regard to Russia and Ukraine. But before we jump into what BRICS may or may not be from a Chinese point of view, what do you think the key lessons so far are for China watching how Russia's experience has been with this? You quite rightly pointed out that China has tried to make it an article of faith that they stand for territorial integrity. They've basically bought and in some ways controlled the United Nations system and the vote count there for some time now, and that's based on inviolability of member states and things like that. And it's taken postures against other perceived aggressors in the past. And so obviously they found a newfound flexibility in their logic. I trust they've also sort of learned the importance of sanction proofing, and I suspect that the idea of decoupling is not something that has come from the United States, but it's a process that was kind of accelerating in China after the kitchen sink of sanctions were put in Russia's way. But those are some areas that come immediately to mind to me. Do those mesh with your assessment, or are there other lessons or perspectives that you think are so far their key takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely studying the conflict, right? And I have to say that, if we could begin to split this on like what are lessons that they're learning militarily or, economically or what have you. you you can imagine there are several interesting lessons that they might be looking into. Militarily, there's a question about where the PLA is today, right? Despite of all of its modernization and restructuring. Now, we can make the argument that the PLA, at least based off the the publications that they put out and we can translate, there's at least a sense that the PLA is a lot more sober than the Russian Federation's military. There's a lot of self-criticism about where the PLA stands. There's a lot of thinking about, are we ready? A lot of very interesting discussions about what it would take to take over Taiwan and what it would take to conduct an amphibious operation of that scale that, again, the PLA has never conducted. And so there's a little bit more of a sober, I guess, self-reflection that happens in the PLA that doesn't seem to have happened in the Russian military. That said, if you're sitting in this, if you're Xi Jinping and in the Standing Committee, you have to imagine that probably looking at how Russia has performed, and given that a lot of China's military was fashioned off the Russian military's own structure and approach to war, there's probably something that has to be reassessed there. I know I would. Mm-hmm. So without a doubt, I think they're learning lessons about this. They're certainly learning lessons about the efficacy of private military contractors, pro or against, right? Just looking off Prigozhin's, attempted coup or whatever framing we want to use, that could be problematic for the CCP. So certainly not a tool that they would like to make use of, even though the vast majority of Belt and Road projects are protected by private security contractors trained in China, right? As opposed to PLA officers going abroad, for example. So militarily, I think they're definitely having to reassess: is our restructuring and modernization and our doctrines, right, on track for the kind of conflict that we envision? I think economically, it raises a couple of more interesting questions than the military one, because on one hand, we can say the United States has done a pretty effective job in lining up our partners and allies, right, and trying to keep them somewhat lined up behind the kinds of sanctions that we've imposed on Russia. And I would argue they've been pretty severe, even if not necessarily on effect. And I would say it has been effective, but again, economic sanctions are a thing that takes time. But the idea that you could rally around dozens of countries to wean themselves off natural gas and oil, right? That you would sanction pretty much all Russian industry, that you would remove them from the SWIFT, that you would, lock their foreign reserves. These are, quite frankly, unprecedented at this scale. So I would say the Chinese have certainly, raised an eyebrow that, well, it seems that if they care enough, right, they'll probably do something serious. Now, with that said, China's a fundamentally different beast than Russia when it comes to economics, right? Russia's economy is important insofar as hydrocarbons and agricultural products. China sits at the center of global supply chains for almost everything, upstream and downstream. So those levels of sanctions are probably not viable unless you are committed to also joining a suicide pact, so to speak, right? You're gonna feel a world of pain. And if that's true, that's problematic from our perspective, because even the sanctions that we put on Russia had an effect on inflation rates around the world. They had an effect on the levels of consumptions in developing and developed countries. And there was a lot of backlash in Europe and even in the United States over energy prices going up and the food prices going up concurrent with that, right? And again, the exposure of the American economy to the Russian economy is negligible. So if it had that kind of effect, we can only begin to estimate what would happen if we try to replicate that level of sanctioning on China. So I think the
Chinese believe that we would.
So that's so in my view, I don't believe that they think that we would go to that extent. That's, however, nothing stops them from planning for something of that scale to happen, right? And I think that gets to your point earlier, that this internal discussion about more self-reliance, right, is coming from this. I would argue this is something that's really picked up pace since the economic, I guess, war between the two countries started. It has effectively convinced the CCP that there are certain industries and certain things that need to be onshore and need to be internally developed and not be so reliant on external powers. There's also the United States track record on using sanction as a tool, right? We're the most prolific users of economic sanctions in the international system. So the Chinese have to think, okay, well, they're already using it in an economic war with us. If push comes to shove, how much worse do they get? So how do we mitigate the problem from that moving forward? So I would say there's a level of confidence that probably we would not, go to the extent that we have gone with Russia for multiple reasons, mutual economic pain, right? The other part is, well, you can never be 100% certain. So you would be stupid not to, right, dedicate some of this investment in some sort of self-reliance.
Well, that kind of takes me to a core point that we talk about in almost every episode of the China Desk, and that is it possible for the United States to have some form of a strategy or a policy of reciprocity in dealing with China? We just alluded to the idea that they began to have an awareness that there might be some key industries or technologies or other qualities within their country that they don't want to be subject to getting closed off by foreign powers, want to have some sense of what I think is now commonly called decoupling. Is there some way that the United States and others could sort of follow a policy or strategy of reciprocity? What is prohibited or constrained for us to do there, then we should consider constraining their ability to do that in our own countries. Or do you think that it's basically they'll talk a game of reciprocity and making sure that we have access and supply chains function, but they just go on behaving the way they choose based on what they want or need, regardless of what this talk might be of some kind of balance or reciprocity between the countries?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure if there's a clean answer to that per se. Our track record is a bit mixed, but it's not entirely a negative one. So, if we look back at our efforts in the strategic and economic dialogue that we used to have under Bush Jr. and the Obama administration, the studies done on those years would indicate that even though we didn't get to where we wanted to go with China 100% of the time, we got pretty close. So a lot of their domestic reforms, legal reforms, economic reforms were significantly influenced by those dialogues and those partnerships at all levels of government. Big thing for us was, intellectual property protections, still is, right? But on that note, China has become the second largest payer of, on intellectual property into United States companies in the world. So certainly something has changed, right? Where they have over time become compliant to many of those restrictions. And surveys done before the pandemic in the chambers of commerce in China and American firms would indicate that American firms were increasingly more confident that their intellectual property was being secured versus prior years. In other words, we were going in the right direction, not where we wanted to get, right? Not where we wanted to be, so to speak. So I do think that reciprocity, depending on the sector we're talking about, probably necessary, right? We clearly see this with semiconductors, but ultimately the effect might be limited, if only because the Chinese are investing significantly in that resource. And they're mainly focused in emerging technologies where they think they're going to be able to leapfrog past something, right? So I think reciprocity will only get you so far depending on which kinds of economic sectors we're talking about. The fundamental problem that I see in the bilateral economic relation was always market access. And what was necessary for market access, right? So we know that there are significant restrictions on American firms entering certain economic sectors in China. A lot of that was predicated on China, well, basically the Chinese wanting to protect national champions in those industries so that they then become internationally competitors to our firms. We've seen that playbook before. Japan did this, Korea did this, Taiwan did this, actually. This is developmental state 101. And so the problem is the scale is fundamentally different, right? Like China is becoming a peer competitor in a lot of emerging technologies, which again puts American firms in a very difficult situation because one, they don't have market access. And now they're having to compete globally on pricing, right? And all these other things that they're just simply not able to compete with. And the problem that produces then is that as Chinese firms gain greater market share in some of these emerging technologies, they get to set the standards for a lot of these emerging techs, which then brings us to another fundamental problem. For the past 100+ years, it's been the United States and European countries that have dominated standard settings in emerging technologies. So we're entering a time period where a lot of very important technologies, especially in information technologies, the Chinese hold the patents and hold the standards for some of these very important things. What do you do then?
Yeah, well, they're not exactly established as a domestic or international brand in protecting free speech, freedom of association, having ethics, a host of things that do come into play. We sort of think of the final frontier of freedom in the 1990s, people thinking that the internet and packet switching technology was going to be the great escape from totalitarian or authoritarian control of information and peoples. And now we're sitting in a position where China emerging into this space as the most advanced surveillance and manipulation state ever known to mankind because of the mastering of some of these technologies. And you don't have the same kind of transparency, accountability, and ethics in that system. And I think it gets back to kind of an old international relations discussion about whether the nature of the state matters when it comes to international relations and global regimes and things like that. And I think we're learning, sadly, that you cannot ignore the nature of the state entirely. And some of the things that are in the nature of the Communist Party of China and the regime that's built in the People's Republic, these would be very problematic, not just for the United States. This is not the US versus China. This is a very different system than most of the rest of the world has given much thought to. And even in the less free parts of the world, probably aren't comfortable with another external power having this kind of leverage or influence over them. So I think it's a fascinating area where they're stepping out into this space. I want to shift gears a little bit before we get out of time to a couple of other areas that I think are in the headlines and are of interest. And it gets at our ongoing education about what are we to make of the things that we're seeing. But can you help us discern? How do we discern which of China's actions should alarm us and which are being blown out of proportion? You brought some interesting leavening perspective about the Belt and Road Initiative, but we've had things that are unprecedented, unusual, that earn extraordinary attention, like the spy balloon, China's increased exercises around Taiwan. You go down the line, there's a lot of things that are very reasonably alarming, but how should we better discern which of these to take as important, and how do we avoid getting them blown out of proportion?
I think that's a great question because there's only so many resources you could allocate to be playing whack-a-mole with everything. So here at the Army War College, when I teach on China and I teach the elective on on China here. The way that I always try to present it is, look, China presents a challenge to the United States. The nature of that challenge changes depending on what we're talking about, right? It's not the same thing at all places at all once. The challenge that China presents in the South China Sea is a fundamentally different challenge than what it presents in the UN or, whatever topic you want to go with. So where do I think we probably are blowing it out of proportion? I think the Belt and Road is probably the easiest one. One of the reasons I say that, beyond the comments I made earlier, we can, so far as A data, which tracks Chinese investments, is probably the best database for this. So much as they've been able to track, Chinese have spent nearly $1 trillion into Belt and Road Initiative. The interesting thing about that is that another $500 billion have been invested into Belt and Road Initiative projects by Western firms, right, and institutions. Which means that Western firms and institutions have been able to profit from many of these projects, right? They're open enough. China builds a road. That road can be used by anybody. China builds electric power and an industrial park somewhere. Well, a firm can use that industrial park, get that power, use that road. I think that matters because as important as a Belt and Road might be for the purpose of influence, etc., if you don't have a seat at the table, you don't get to complain much, right? So I think it requires a bit of more sober look at the role of the Belt and Road and where and when we should challenge or perhaps complement so that we can actually have a seat at the table. The other areas are the idea of parallel institutions, right? BRICS comes up regularly. I've seen my fair share reporting in the last 2 weeks of people talking about de-dollarization. It's been steady 60% literally since the 1990s, the role of the dollar in the international economy. And the Chinese, yuan, the renminbi is just simply not going to be an international economy unless the CCP chooses to allow that currency to float freely. And they're simply not going to because it takes away one of the core pillars of how they manage and reallocate resources internally in China. So I think the BRICS, for example, yes, it's a massive institution if you're thinking about the economic impact it can have. But the New Development Bank, which is under BRICS, most of their projects are in partnerships with the World Bank, with the Asian Development Bank, with other international institutions. So I don't see necessarily parallel competing institutions, but rather complementarity, simply because there's a demand for development projects around the world. So I'd say on the Belt and Road, on BRICS, we're probably overhyping the problem, so to speak.
Well, I mean, the kind of money question when it comes to this sort of area of inquiry is, do you believe China will conduct a land war with Taiwan, and how effective can they be if the world community comes to the aid of Taiwan, similar to how they have with Ukraine? And so do you think China believes that they could be effective, and do you think they could be effective in doing that?
I don't think, if as far as I've been able to see on PLA's own writing, they don't think they're ready.
Yeah.
And they don't think they'll be ready in the coming years simply because, again, if we think about it, the restructuring of the PLA is less than a decade old, right? And it takes a very long time to, set up all your doctrines, train to that doctrine, and get the capability to be able to do something like that. So I don't think the PLA believes it's there. That doesn't mean that Xi Jinping won't make a decision, right? Mm-hmm. Which is part of the reason why he says, I want you to be ready, because that's a tool. But on that point, I would place myself in the position that Taiwan is a problem insofar as we want to make it a problem. Let me clarify what I mean by that. Mm-hmm. If you look at the priority of policies in the PRC right now, almost all of them are focused around economics, development, social stability. The last thing they really want to have to deal with right now is what any potential fallout might happen because of Taiwan. So the only way in my head that I can think of Taiwan becoming an issue is one, inadvertent escalation. Stuff happens because of, somebody crashes into somebody else in the air or rams somebody else in the straits. Then you got yourself a serious problem. The other is if the CCP's leadership comes to the conclusion that time is not on their side. Now, we've probably heard our fair share of both uniformed officers and scholars make an argument for 2027 or 2035. But Xi Jinping has never actually given you an exact date for unification. And in fact, the closest we can get to a clear statement on him and Taiwan, we can't keep pushing this problem off to future generations. By 2049, we expect to, have a modern, powerful nation. If that was a priority, 2049 does not tell me that it is, right? We're still a long ways away from there. So he clearly has bigger fish to fry than having to deal with Taiwan in the short term. So this is why I think it becomes a problem if we make it a problem insofar as we use it as a leverage to negotiate with China. It seems to be, just based off the way that Xi Jinping has begun to talk about Taiwan, beginning with the Trump administration, but quite frankly, still even into the Biden administration, he seems to have come to the conclusion that something has changed in America's policy towards Taiwan. No matter how many times we keep talking about our one China, position, he inherently thinks that what used to be that Taiwan is a side issue that we're not going to deal with, it only flares up every time there's an arms sale or something like that, has now become a core component of the bilateral relationship because the Americans, in his view, have come to view Taiwan as a strategic asset that must be defended or can be utilized to negotiate and extract concessions from China. So when he says you're playing with fire, right, when Wang Yi also says you're playing with fire, they refer precisely to this. It's like something has fundamentally changed over there, and therefore we think that you are playing with fire. So I think that that might also explain, quite frankly, a lot of the higher tempo and exercises too, because if you think about this, our last major crisis was in the 1990s. We're not counting Pelosi's visit there because the scale of that is just not, at least internationally, was not the same scale in my view. What's odd about that event is that both sides claim victory, right? From our perspective, we deterred the Chinese from going further, and the Chinese basically said we got the Americans to reiterate that, what their position was, and it's a position that we want them to take, which again, not accurate. But you have two sides that think they want a conflict, but certainly the capabilities are fundamentally different. And I would argue that now the Chinese believe that, at least when it comes to the proximate region, that balance has shifted. And so this higher tempo of exercises is a demonstration of force of, we don't actually think that you can dictate terms the way that you did in 1995, 96. Probably not ideal if you're sitting in DC and you're seeing that perspective, though.
Yeah, it's an interesting interpretation, not one I've heard articulated by very many people. And I just emphasize to the audience, when you're using the force to explain how the Chinese leadership think, it's not necessarily how you think or what you, what you want to happen or what you think will happen. We're all just using what we can know to gauge how they might think, so that we can be careful and maybe make as informed choices as we can. We certainly hope our leadership does. If anyone who's sort of sitting back watching how things have unfolded would probably find it quite shocking and almost laughable to think that America has been trying to amplify Taiwan as some kind of a negotiating chip, when they really watched the CCP amp up the persecution in Xinjiang, crush freedom in Hong Kong. I mean, that really sets anyone observing on edge, including everyone in Taiwan. And if you seek peaceful unification with the promise of being a special administrative region, probably the worst thing you can do is crush another special administrative region the way they did in Hong Kong. But we're at the point of our discussion where I want to try to walk out with one question that maybe you weren't anticipating, but you open the door to it because, very interestingly, you mentioned that you come from Cuba. And when Americans think about Cuban Americans and the thoughts they have about the world, they tend to think of a culture that was quite strong in its views with regard to communism, and also about strong feelings about America, democracy, things like that. And those are kind of some interesting, strong ideals to have getting into the field of studying China that has been dominated by people who are more filled with romance about China than skepticism or concern, in my humble estimation. How has your cultural and upbringing experiences animated how you think and have perceived China and China policy generally?
That's a very interesting question because, when I left Cuba and came to the U.S., you can see the fundamental differences, right? I'm not even talking about just simple economic differences. Those were very obvious. But just how classes are conducted, students asking questions. So you start to notice these things. And I don't think that's a uniquely Cuban thing. I think, immigrant students, when they come to the United States, they can kind of make those comparisons. And really fascinating, right? When I think back about the neighborhood watch in Cuba and what that meant in practice, right? My family tried leaving Cuba 5 times, which tells you we failed 4 times. And those 4 failures happened because our neighbors reported us. And these are family lifelong friends. They still are. But they had to, right? Mm-hmm. If we were gone and somebody comes knocking, like, how did you not know this was going to happen? Right? That's on you and your family. Collective punishment's a thing, right? So how has that shaped the way that I study China, the way that I guess maybe see the world more broadly, is that I lived both. I lived in an oppressive authoritarian regime, and I've lived in the United States, right? I've traveled. So when I go to China, I can see the monumental changes that have happened there, even in the short time that I've studied it, quite frankly, 2012 till now, right? Economically has transformed. I've been to rural China year on year and fundamentally changed. High-speed rail everywhere, the wonderful skyscrapers, all of that stuff. But you also notice the surveillance. Mm-hmm. You also notice what people say and how they say it and where they say it, right? You pick up on these things that if you're not very attentive, you miss, right? And so I guess to the extent that that's something that matters, that's kind of how I would answer that question. Like I feel like I am more keen and more attentive to the very little things as I walk around the streets in China, or walk here in the U.S., et cetera, because of those experiences.
Well, I appreciate that. I think that you really bring an angle, a vision to what we are talking about each episode that adds another layer of understanding, and also sort of challenges us to think of things differently ourselves, perhaps in a few important areas that we covered today. Now, Zenel, what can you please share with our audience if they want to follow your commentary and your written work? Where should they go?
I'm an active Twitter user, but I'm more of a lurker than a poster. I tend to share a lot of things, but I'm on Twitter. Zenel25, I think, is my handle. So that's one place where you can follow me. I post my research there as well. Usually when I publish something, I'll have a short synopsis of it there. I publish a more public commentary in both the Diplomat and the Policy Forum, hosted out of Australia National University. And I just published a co-authored piece with Dr. Christine Bianco on the impact of Chinese history on perceptions of the Law of the Sea and the South China Sea, which I think for any of your listeners that might be interested in the South China Sea and how the Chinese think historically about that claim and where it originates from, they might find that interesting.
Well, that's excellent. That reminds me that we've got another area to take a deep dive into in a future conversation. So for our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Zenel Garcia for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.